After 5 years, a girl finally wakes up from a coma and with wide eyes tells her father something terrible. What she reveals changes everything. Isabela was a vibrant little girl, her laughter filling the house, and her parents, Raphael and Clara, could not have been happier. To them, Isabela was a ray of sunshine, always brightening even the grayest days. But everything began to change on a regular Sunday afternoon. She was playing with her favorite doll, little Leah, when she suddenly stopped and brought her hands to her head. "It hurts, Daddy," she said with a trembling voice. Raphael, who was sitting next to her watching her play, felt a tightness in his chest. Quickly got up and went to her. "What is it, sweetheart? Where does it hurt?" Isabela pointed to her left temple. "Here, it's throbbing so much." Clara, who was in the kitchen preparing dinner, heard the conversation and approached, drying her hands on her apron. "What happened, darling?" she asked, kneeling beside Isabela. In the following days, Isabela's headaches became more frequent. Every time she felt pain, her parents felt the desperation growing inside them. Isabela's smile, which used to be constant, was starting to fade. The playful moments that once filled the house with joy were now interrupted by cries of pain and sleepless nights. Clara spent hours by Isabela's bedside, holding her little hand and trying to soothe her, while Raphael, with a heavy heart, relentlessly searched online, trying to understand what might be happening. One night, the pain was so intense that Isabela fainted. Raphael and Clara exchanged worried glances. Fear etched on their faces. "We need to take her to the hospital now," Clara said, her voice trembling. They scooped her up into their arms and rushed to the car, both of their hearts pounding so loudly that they could barely hear the sound of the tires screeching on the wet asphalt. The drive to the hospital seemed endless. Isabela was unconscious in the back seat, and every second that passed without her waking made the panic inside them grow. Upon arriving at the hospital, they were met by a medical team who quickly took Isabela to the emergency room. Raphael and Clara stood in the hallway, holding hands, feeling utterly powerless. Raphael looked at Clara and saw tears streaming down her face. He hugged her, trying to convey a strength he himself did not feel. "She'll be okay," he whispered, trying to convince himself as much as her. The sound of hurried footsteps from the doctors, the constant beeping of monitors, and the distant murmur of urgent conversations filled the air. But Raphael and Clara felt as though they were in a silent void where the only thing that existed was fear for what would happen to their daughter. After what seemed like an eternity, the doctor finally came out of the emergency room. He looked at Raphael and Clara with a serious expression. "We need to run some more detailed tests," he said. "Isabela's headaches don't seem to be just a common migraine." Raphael felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean by that, doctor?" Clara asked, her voice choking. The doctor sighed, choosing his words carefully. "We need to rule out some things. Could be something serious, and we need to be prepared for that." Clara let out a stifled sob, and Raphael held her tighter. "Whatever it is, we will do whatever it takes," he said with determination, though his heart was heavy with uncertainty. That moment, he knew that whatever journey lay ahead would be a long battle, and all he wanted was to have his daughter healthy again. Running around the yard, her smile lighting up their lives. After a series of tests, the initial results did not provide clear answers. The doctors explained that Isabela's symptoms could be caused by a common viral infection, perhaps something she picked up at school or the playground. Raphael and Clara felt a slight relief, imagining that a simple treatment would be enough for their little girl to return to being the healthy and cheerful child she once was. However, this peace was short-lived. In the following days, Isabela's symptoms worsened alarmingly. The headaches became more intense and frequent, now accompanied by high fever and vomiting. At night, Clara sat by Isabela's hospital bed, holding her little hand and praying for the pain to pass. With every spasm of pain that coursed through the fragile body of their daughter, Clara's heart tightened a little more. Raphael, on the other hand, spent hours awake, pacing back and forth in the hospital waiting room, feeling increasingly helpless. "Something is not right," Raphael said to Clara one morning as they watched Isabela sleep in the hospital bed. Her face was pale, the usual sparkle in her eyes had disappeared, and the sight of their daughter so vulnerable left them utterly devastated. Clara nodded, wiping away tears. We need to find someone who really understands what's going on with her. We can't just wait for things to get better on their own. Determined to do whatever it took, Raphael and Clara decided to seek a second opinion. They tirelessly researched pediatric neurology specialists, those reputed to be the best in the field. After hours of calls and recommendations, they managed to schedule an appointment with Dr. Helena Almeida, a renowned pediatric neurologist known for tackling complex cases. The visit to Dr. Helena's office was a mix of hope and fear. Upon arrival, they were greeted with a warm smile from the doctor, but the seriousness in her eyes was not unnoticed. "Let's start from the beginning," Dr. Helena said, after listening attentively to the description of the symptoms and their experiences up to that point. "We need to conduct some more specific tests to better understand what might be happening with Isabela." The recommended tests included an MRI, lumbar puncture, and a battery of other tests. Each procedure was more difficult than the last, not only for Isabela but also for Raphael and Clara, who watched helplessly, unable to alleviate their daughter's pain and discomfort. Every tear that fell from Isabela's eyes during the tests seemed to cut her parents' hearts into pieces. They took turns by her side, holding her hand, whispering words of comfort, trying in some way to offer a small measure of security in a world that had become frighteningly uncertain. After a week of agonizing waiting, the results of the new tests finally arrived. Dr. Helena called them for a meeting, and Raphael and Clara knew that the moment of truth had come. The doctor's office felt colder that day. They sat hand in hand, trying to stay calm while Dr. Helena reviewed the papers in front of her. "I wish the news were better," she began, with a serious and compassionate expression. "The results indicate that what Isabela is facing may be something more serious than a viral infection." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean by that, doctor?" The voice was almost inaudible, laden with concern. Dr. Helena took a deep breath before answering. "The symptoms and the test results suggest that there might be inflammation in the brain. It is possible that it could be encephalitis, a condition that can be caused by an infection, or, in some cases, an autoimmune response from the body." The ground seemed to open up beneath Raphael's feet. "What does this mean for our daughter? Is she going to be okay?" he asked, his voice faltering under the weight of emotion. Dr. Helena looked at them with compassion. "It is a serious condition, but it is not impossible to treat. We need to act quickly and start treatment immediately to control the inflammation and try to prevent permanent damage." The hospital room was silent, except for the constant beep of the heart monitor beside Isabela's bed. The bright, white lights reflected an environment that seemed more like a waiting room for sadness than a place of healing. The air was thick with uncertainty and fear, weighing heavily on Raphael and Clara's shoulders like an unbearable burden. Isabela, their sweet little Isabela, now lying motionless, seemed so distant despite being just a few feet away. After the devastating diagnosis of encephalitis, the doctors immediately began treatment. Raphael and Clara clung to the tiny bit of hope they had left, believing, or perhaps forcing themselves to believe, that Isabela might overcome this battle. Yet Isabela's condition continued to deteriorate. Days passed, and while Isabela's condition remained stable, consciousness began to fade. Dr. Helena explained that the inflammation in the brain was causing significant pressure, affecting her ability to respond to treatment. "She may go into a coma," the doctor said softly, her face reflecting the gravity of the situation. These words echoed in Clara's mind like a silent scream. "Please, no," she whispered, almost as if speaking to herself, desperately trying to ward off that thought. Then the inevitable happened. On a gray morning, while Raphael was bringing coffee for Clara from the hospital cafe, the monitor beside Isabela's bed began emitting a sharp alarm. Clara, sitting beside her daughter, froze. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room, quickly working around the bed, and Raphael ran back, spilling coffee on the floor without noticing. He grabbed Clara's hand, his eyes wide with panic. "What's happening?" he asked desperately. "She's going into a coma," one of the nurses said quickly while adjusting the equipment. Raphael and Clara were paralyzed, feeling a fear so deep it seemed to take the air from their lungs. They watched helplessly as the small light in Isabela's eyes dimmed, and she slipped into a state of absolute silence. Devastation hit them like a tidal wave. Time seemed to freeze at that moment, trapping them in a nightmare from which they could not awaken. Raphael fell to his knees beside the bed, holding Isabella's cold hand. "Please, darling, come back to us," he whispered through tears, his voice breaking with desperation. Clara, beside him, could only stare at her daughter's expressionless face, a dull pain growing inside her, pain words could not describe. The following days were marked by endless agony. The hope they had clung to so desperately began to fade. Friends and family came to the hospital to offer their support, but nothing seemed to lift the weight of the sadness that now dominated their lives. Raphael and Clara became shadows of themselves, living day after day in a somber routine of vigil by Isabella's side. They talked to her, recounting stories from her younger days, recalling happy moments in an attempt to bring her back, but the words seemed to fall into emptiness. Dr. Helena called Raphael and Clara for a private meeting. She explained that, while Isabela was in a coma, there was still a chance, however small, for recovery. However, there was also a real possibility that she might never wake up. "We need to consider what is best for her," Dr. Helena said, her voice softening only to intensify the gravity of the situation. Raphael shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "We're not giving up on her," he said firmly, his voice trembling but filled with stubborn determination. Clara, however, remained silent. She felt a mix of emotion, pain, despair, and a tiny spark of hope. But there was also an overwhelming guilt that kept her awake every night. She began to question everything, every decision, every moment she thought she was doing the right thing. What if? Was a thought she couldn't shake. In the dark corridors of the hospital, Raphael and Clara leaned on each other. Their conversations became increasingly difficult. They felt the weight of the world on their shoulders, and the distance between them began to grow, fueled by their shared suffering. Raphael held on to his faith, believing that a miracle was still possible. Clara, on the other hand, felt herself being consumed more and more by the pain and the fear of losing her daughter forever. The years passed slowly like a river of sadness, relentless and constant. Isabela remained lying in her hospital bed, so small and fragile, surrounded by machines monitoring every beat of her heart and every breath she took. 4 years had passed since she fell into a coma, and Raphael and Clara's world had turned into an endless cycle of hospital visits, medical consultations, and sleepless nights. Hope, once a bright flame, was now just an ember, nearly extinguished but still burning, stubbornly clinging to the possibility of a miracle. Raphael and Clara were exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. The hospital walls, once cold and impersonal, had become almost familiar, like a second home. They knew every nurse, every doctor by name, and each of the daily procedures by heart. The routine that once seemed endless was now their refuge, the only constant in a world that had become unbearably uncertain. Clara, who had always been the pillar of the family, felt increasingly lost. Her energy, once seemingly infinite, was almost depleted. She remembered when Isabela was a baby, how full of life she was, laughing and playing, and how her eyes sparkled with joy. Now all that remained were memories. Memories that brought both comfort and pain. She spent hours by Isabela's bed, softly talking to her unconscious daughter, reading her favorite books, singing the lullabies she used to sing when Isabela was little. The response never came. The only thing that broke the silence was the constant sound of the machines, the relentless reminder of the reality they faced. Raphael, on the other hand, dealt with the situation differently. He refused to give up hope, even when everything seemed lost. He spent long nights researching experimental treatments, alternative therapies, anything that could bring his daughter back. He read scientific studies, spoke with specialists from other states, and even considered taking Isabela for treatments abroad. Clara saw how much this consumed him, and it worried her. Raphael's obstinacy was like a double-edged sword. It kept his hope alive, but also distanced him from reality. Sometimes she wished he could accept what had happened, that he could find peace amid the chaos. But then she remembered that maybe he was right to keep fighting. Tensions began to grow between them. Pain and stress started to affect their marriage. Conversations turned into arguments, small differences of opinion turned into explosive fights. They were not only fighting for Isabela's life, but also for their own survival as a couple. On one particularly difficult night, after an intense argument, Clara left the hospital and went down the stairs to the garden. She sat on a stone bench, tears flowing freely down her face. She looked up at the sky, the stars shining like small beacons of hope in a sea of darkness. "I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered, feeling the weight of each word. "Please, help us." Meanwhile, Raphael stayed by Isabela's side, holding her tiny hand in his. He whispered words of love and hope, promising her that he would never give up, that he would always be there, waiting for her, no matter how long it took. He believed, needed to believe, that she could hear him. Somehow, his words were reaching his daughter's sleeping consciousness. Friends and family, who had been a constant support system in the beginning, began to drift away, not out of a lack of love, but because life continued for them. There were weddings, births, and even deaths that needed attention, and Raphael and Clara, despite the support they had received, began to feel increasingly alone. The isolation was an invisible prison, very real. They were trapped in a bubble of pain that no one else could truly understand. Clara began to doubt herself. Strength. She wondered if it was selfish to keep waiting, keep hoping for a miracle that might never come. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked Raphael one night, her voice a fragile whisper. He looked at her with determination in his eyes and said, "She is our daughter. As long as there is a chance, even if it's 1 in a million, we will fight for her." His words comforted her, but also terrified her. What if they were waiting for something that would never come? What if their blind faith was only prolonging Isabela's suffering? She didn't know the answers. No one did. All she could do was continue putting one foot in front of the other, keep fighting day by day, hoping that one day Isabela might open her eyes and come back to. After long debates and sleepless nights, Raphael and Clara made a decision that would change everything: to bring Isabela back home. "She needs to feel like she's at home," Clara said finally, her eyes fixed on the hospital room window. Raphael nodded silently, holding his wife's hand firmly, knowing that this change was essential for all of them. The decision was followed by a frantic race to adapt the house to Isabela's new needs. Her room, which had remained untouched for years as a sanctuary of her memories, had to be transformed into a space equipped for medical care. The hospital bed was installed next to the shelves filled with toys and books, now dusty and forgotten. Tubes and machines invaded the space, taking over the place that once belonged to the dreams of a 6-year-old child. The first night of Isabela at home was a mix of emotions for Raphael and Clara. On one hand, there was a strange sense of comfort in finally having her back home, surrounded by her things, her smell, her still tangible presence. On the other hand, the reality of her condition was inescapable. Each beep of the machines was a cruel reminder that their daughter was present, still so distant. Clara tried to create a routine that would bring some normalcy to the home. She read stories to Isabela every night, the same ones she used to read before everything changed. Sometimes she found herself smiling as she recalled Isabela's laughter when she was younger, her giggles filling the room with joy. But these moments of happiness were always followed by a wave of overwhelming sadness. Isabela no longer laughed. Her eyes remained closed, and her breathing was guided by the machines around her. Raphael, on the other hand, threw himself into the medical care. He learned to operate all the machines, change dressings, and monitor Isabela's vital signs. He was determined to do everything he could to keep his daughter comfortable and safe. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just about caring for her. It was a way to feel that he still had some control, a way to fight against the helplessness he felt daily. Constant presence of medical equipment and the exhausting routine began to affect the family dynamic. Clara started to feel suffocated by the weight of her new reality. She looked around the house and no longer saw the cozy home it once was. Instead, she saw an improvised hospital, prison disguised as a home. Raphael, always so optimistic, seemed not to notice the transformation. He continued to insist that the move home was the right decision, that being in a familiar environment would help Isabela feel the love surrounding her. But as days turned into weeks, exhaustion began to take its toll. Raphael and Clara barely recognized themselves in the mirror. Dark circles marked their faces, and the hope that once shone in their eyes was now extinguished. Raphael continued to repeat the same words of encouragement. They began to sound hollow, lacking the strength they once had. Clara, on the other hand, grew increasingly silent, retreating into a space where even Raphael couldn't reach her. Visits from the few friends and family members who still came by became painful. Everyone wanted to know how they were coping. The truth was hard to explain. How do you tell someone that each day is a battle against despair? How do you explain that, even with Isabela at home, they felt further from her than ever? One night, after another endless day of care and worry, Clara finally broke down. "I can't take it anymore, Raphael," she said, her voice filled with tears. "I can't stand seeing her like this every day and not knowing if she will ever wake up." Raphael tried to comfort her, but he was on the brink of breaking down himself. "I know," he whispered, holding her tightly, "but we have to believe. We have to believe that she can feel us, that she knows we are here, fighting for her." The 5 years dragged on like an endless night, each dawn bringing with it the weight of another day without answers, without relief. For Clara, it felt as though time had stopped the moment Isabela closed her eyes and never opened them again. The house was filled with ghosts of the past, the muffled laughter that echoed through the walls, the light steps of Isabela running down the hallway, the tight hugs that now felt so distant. Raphael and Clara lived in a stagnant routine, each movement carefully orchestrated around Isabela's needs and the machines that sustained her fragile existence. Clara could no longer bear it. One night, after a long day of visits from nurses, physiotherapists, and concerned friends, Clara sat alone in the kitchen. She looked at the dining table, where they had so often shared meals, where Isabela had made her first drawing. She remembered Isabela's radiant face as she showed off her first painting, a smudged rainbow she proudly called the most beautiful in the world. Tears filled her eyes. She knew that, at that moment, she couldn't take it anymore. She was broken, shattered inside. Guilt and pain ate away at her every day, and she no longer recognized herself in the mirror. It was as if a shadow had taken her place. Tired, lifeless woman. She loved Isabela with all her heart, but she felt that if she stayed, there would be nothing left of her. Clara slowly stood up, walked to Isabela's room, and stood there in the doorway, watching her. She looked so small in that bed, surrounded by machines that whispered in unison with her breathing. "I love you so much, my daughter," she murmured, feeling the tears streaming down her face. "But I can't do this anymore." She turned and went to the room she shared with Raphael. There, she began to pack a suitcase. Each piece of clothing she put inside felt like a brick being removed from a wall. She was dismantling the life she knew, brick by brick, preparing to flee from what remained. Her heart was heavy, each beat sounding like a war drum inside her chest. She knew she couldn't say goodbye to Raphael. He would never understand. He would convince her to stay, to fight one more day, one more week, and she no longer had the strength to fight. Raphael arrived home early that night. He found her in the room, her trembling hands holding the partially open suitcase. "Clara?" His voice was filled with concern. "What are you doing?" Clara froze, her back turned to him. The words caught in her throat, but she knew she couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. "Can't do this anymore, Raphael," she said, turning slowly to face him. Her eyes were red, marked by the pain and the decision she had made. "I'm broken. I feel like I'm dying every day. I need to get out of here." Raphael stared at her, shocked. He knew things had been tough, but he never imagined she would reach this point. "Are you saying you're going to leave us?" he asked, his voice breaking at the end. "Leave Isabela?" Clara closed her eyes, trying to block out the look of pain in Raphael's eyes. "I don't want to, Raphael, but if I stay, I'll die with her. I need time, to breathe, to understand what's left of me." He wanted to scream, to hold her, and stop her from leaving, but looking at her, he saw the desperation consuming her. Raphael knew he loved Clara too much to keep her in a life that was destroying her. "If this is what you need," he began, his voice trembling, "then go. But know that we will always be here. Isabela and I will be waiting for you." Clara was staring at the open suitcase on the bed, Each piece of clothing she folded seemed to weigh tons. Emotions were running high, and guilt hovered over her like a heavy cloud. She felt torn apart, but she knew that leaving was the only way to try to find any remnant of herself. However, the sound of paper being handled captured her attention. She turned around and saw Raphael standing in the doorway, holding a stack of papers with an expression of disbelief mixed with hope. "Clara, wait," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I think I found something. Something that could change everything." Clara sighed, exhausted. "Raphael, please. I've made my decision. There's nothing more we can do." "No, you need to hear this," he insisted, his eyes shining with an intensity she hadn't seen in a long time. He walked into the room, papers trembling in his hands. "I was in the office, sorting through some things, and I found this in our medical correspondence. It's about a new experimental treatment. They're looking for patients in deep comas, exactly what Isabela is facing." Clara looked at him skeptically. "Experimental treatment? Raphael, how many times have we heard empty promises? How many times have we clung to some hope only to have everything shattered again?" "I know, Clara," he replied, approaching her. "But this time is different. They have promising results. They have helped other patients come out of comas. Clara, we need to try. Please, just one more chance." She wanted to resist, to stick to her decision to leave, but something in Raphael's voice, the way he held those papers as if they were the last lifeline, made her hesitate. He extended the papers to her, and with trembling hands, she took them. Her eyes scanned the printed words, absorbing every detail. The treatment was innovative, something she had never heard of before. They used a combination of brain stimulation and regenerative therapies, a new and bold approach that was starting to gain traction in the medical community. "And what if it doesn't work?" she whispered, hardly recognizing her own voice. "What if we're just deceiving ourselves again?" Raphael approached and took her hand. "And what if it works, Clara? And what if this is our chance to bring our daughter back? I know we're tired. I know we're broken, but I can't give up on her, Clara. I can't. And I don't think you really want to either." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the tears run down her face. She was so tired of fighting, so exhausted from living in emotional limbo. But looking at Raphael, seeing the spark of hope still burning in his eyes, she felt something inside her begin to melt. It was as if a small, nearly extinguished flame was trying to reignite. "Please, Clara," Raphael pleaded, his voice almost a whisper. "Just one more chance. If not for us, then for her. She deserves that we try everything we can." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, papers still in her hand, now damp with her tears. She thought of Isabela, her little girl who had been so full of life, so full of laughter and dreams. She thought of the promise she had made to herself to never give up on her daughter, no matter how difficult it was. And now, here she was, about to break that promise. "All right," he finally said, her voice trembling, almost inaudible. "I'll stay. But Raphael, if this doesn't work..." He interrupted her, holding her tightly. "Thank you, Clara. Thank you for not giving up on her. For not giving up on us." They stood there, embraced, both crying, both feeling the weight of the decision they had just made. It was a risk, a leap into the dark, but it was the only leap they could take now. Raphael knew this treatment could be their last chance. And even though the fear of failure was overwhelming, he also knew that the fear of not trying was even worse. In the following weeks, they began preparing everything for the new treatment. They made contacts with the responsible medical team, filled out endless forms, and waited anxiously for confirmation that Isabela could be a viable candidate. Finally, the call they had been waiting for came. "Mrs. Clara, Mr. Raphael," said the voice on the other end of the line. "We have good news. Isabela has been accepted into the experimental treatment program. We will start preparations to transfer her to our special unit next week." Raphael held Clara's hand as she trembled, hearing the words that could mean a new beginning for them. He heard the doctor's voice, felt Raphael's grip on his hand, and for the first time in years felt something akin to relief. It was a chance, a last attempt to bring their daughter back. Clara and Raphael took turns by Isabela's bedside, watching every movement, every sign of life could indicate a change. Raphael sat in the corner chair, his eyes heavy with fatigue. Clara barely left Isabela's side, fearing that any absence might mean missing the crucial moment they had been waiting for. On that particular morning, there was something different about the atmosphere in the room. The nurse who came to check Isabela's vital signs lingered longer than usual, frowning as she read the monitors. Clara, who was beside the bed holding her daughter's hand, noticed the change in the nurse's expression. "What's wrong?" Clara asked, her voice trembling with anxiety. The nurse hesitated, seemingly choosing her words carefully. "Isabela's brain activity levels, they're increasing," she finally said, with a spark of surprise in her voice. "I'll call the doctor." Clara felt her heart race. She squeezed Isabela's hand as if holding it tighter could bring her daughter back faster. Raphael got up from his chair, crossing the room in 2 long strides to stand next to Clara. They exchanged a look filled with hope and fear, both apprehensive to believe what they were hearing. Minutes later, Dr. Moreno, the chief neurologist of the experimental treatment, entered the room. He examined the monitors and then turned to Clara and Raphael, his face serene, but his eyes shining with an emotion he rarely allowed to show. "Brain activity levels are significantly higher than before," he confirmed. "This is a good sign. Very good sign." Clara could barely hold back her tears. "What does this mean? Will she wake up?" Dr. Moreno took a deep breath. "I can't make any promises. This is the first indication that the treatment is working. We need to continue monitoring closely. It's a big step." In the days that followed, the signs continued to improve. Each small increase in brain activity was a victory celebrated silently, a relief that slowly spread among them. Then, one calm afternoon, as Clara was telling Isabela a story, one of her childhood favorites about a brave girl facing dragons, she felt something. A movement, a slight pressure in Isabela's hand. Clara stopped, her heart racing in her chest. She looked at her daughter's hand, hoping it was not her imagination. But then it happened again. A contraction, an almost imperceptible squeeze. "Raphael," Clara called, her voice barely controlled by emotion. Raphael, who had been on the phone with the office, quickly hung up and rushed to the bedside. Clara was crying, tears of joy and disbelief streaming down her face. "She squeezed my hand." Raphael took Isabela's other hand, the eyes fixed on her face. "Isabela," he whispered, his voice choked. "If you can hear us, please move your fingers again." And then, as if the heavens themselves had opened, Isabela's fingers moved, more firmly this time. Clear and unmistakable squeeze. It was like an electric shock coursing through their bodies. Clara let out a cry of pure emotion, and Raphael began to cry, laughing through his tears. It didn't take long for the room to fill with doctors and nurses, all watching in disbelief, as Isabela showed signs of life. She was fighting to come back to them. The monitors recorded increasing brain activity, and soon Isabela's eyes began to flutter, trying to open. When she finally did, Clara and Raphael's eyes met their daughters for the first time in 4 long years. Moments that felt like eternities passed, while everyone in the room held their breath, waiting for that first sign of recognition. And then, slowly, Isabela's lips curled into a small smile. A smile that seemed to echo through every heart in that room. "Daddy, Mommy," she murmured, voice weak, clearly audible. Clara broke down in tears, and Raphael, feeling the wave of relief and joy flood his soul, kept repeating, "We're here, dear, we're here, we've always been here." The news spread quickly throughout the hospital. The previously silent corridors were now filled with whispers and murmurs about the miracle in room 204. Doctors from other wards came to see for themselves. There were hugs, applause, and tears. The hospital room was still vibrating with the recent miracle of Isabela's recovery. Doctors and nurses came and went, checking monitors, observing her vital signs, and exchanging looks of astonishment and joy. Isabela was back, not just conscious, but truly present. Her eyes were open, her gaze focused, and there was a light in them suggesting a depth of understanding that no one could have imagined. Raphael held Isabela's hand, their fingers intertwined as if he would never let go. Clara stood by, her gaze fixed on her daughter, her eyes still red from crying. The joy of seeing Isabela back was immense, but there was something in the girl's expression that worried her. A seriousness, a weight in her eyes that shouldn't be there for a 9-year-old child. "Isabela," Raphael whispered, his voice choked with emotion, "we love you so much. We never gave up on you." Isabela looked at her father, her large, broad, expressive eyes filling with tears. She squeezed his hand with a surprising strength for someone who had just come out of a 4-year coma. "Daddy." "I know," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I heard everything." The room fell into absolute silence. Clara and Raphael exchanged a puzzled glance. Raphael leaned in closer, trying to understand what Isabela meant. "You heard everything?" he repeated, confused. Isabela nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. "All the time. While I was in the coma. Could hear you. Everything." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. Her heart raced and her hands began to tremble. "Isabela, you heard? What exactly?" Isabela looked directly at her mother, and the pain in her eyes was palpable. "I heard you crying, Mommy. I heard your prayers and your cries of despair. I heard the arguments between you and Daddy. I heard when you wanted to give up and leave everything behind." Clara felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Tears began to stream down her face as she struggled to find words. "Isabela, I was so lost, so desperate." But Isabela continued, her voice now stronger, filled with emotion. "But I also heard Daddy. I heard him talking to me every night, telling me he loved me, that I was strong, that I could come back. He never stopped believing, never stopped loving me. He held my hand and told me stories, talked about what we would do when I woke up. It was his love, your love, that brought me back." Raphael felt a wave of emotions crash within him, relief, gratitude, and a deep sadness as he realized how much his daughter had suffered in silence. He pulled Isabela into a tight embrace, tears streaming freely down his face. "I never gave up on you, my love," he whispered in her ear. "Never." Clara watched the scene, chest tight with a mix of conflicting emotion. She felt guilty, devastated to know that her daughter had heard her weakest, most vulnerable moment. She thought of all the times she wanted to run away, all the times she lost hope. But at the same time, she felt an immense relief that Isabela had returned, that she still had a chance to make things right. "Isabela," Clara began, her voice trembling, "forgive me. I was so desperate. I thought I couldn't go on." Isabela looked at her mother, her eyes filled with an unexpected wisdom for a child of her age. "I forgive you, Mommy. I know it was hard. I felt your pain, but now we're together again." Clara began to cry openly, falling to her knees beside Isabela's bed, holding her daughter's hand with both hands, as if her life depended on it. "I love you so much, Isabela, and I promise I will never give up again. Never." Relief and gratitude that flooded the room were palpable. Raphael and Clara embraced, holding Isabela in the middle, all three united in a hug that was both an apology, a renewed vow, and a silent celebration of a miracle. They were together again, for real, and that was all that mattered. The doctors and nurses watching the scene from outside the room couldn't help but be moved. It was rare to witness such a profound miracle, and Isabela's story would be one that would stay in their hearts forever. If you enjoyed this emotional story, write in the comment, "I loved this story." This way, I will know that you stayed until the end. Now stay tuned for another touching story.